Good morning. Good morning. What a beautiful morning it is. I'm Gregory Long. I know many of you. I have the honor of being the president of the New York Botanical Garden, and it's a pleasure to welcome you here today to Native Plant Garden Day in New York City. This is it. This is the day we've been waiting for quite a while. After this morning's symposium, everyone is invited to the ribbon-cutting ceremony at the entrance to the new Native Plant Garden on Azalea Way, and you'll all see for yourselves what a gorgeous new addition this garden is going to be to the already established pleasures of the New York Botanical Garden. This garden, with all of its accompanying educational materials and also a very substantial endowment, has been a gift to the New York Botanical Garden from the Leon Levy Foundation. And I want everyone to know that the distinguished trustees of the Leon Levy Foundation are here with us this morning. Shelby White. Shelby is also the vice chairman of the board and has been for many years the vice chairman of the board of the New York Botanical Garden. And Elizabeth Moynihan, her co-trustee, Mrs. Daniel Patrick Moynihan. Also with us is John Bernstein, the president of the Leon Levy Foundation. This morning's program has been engineered over the past year and a half by Todd Forrest, the Arthur Ross Vice President for Horticulture and Living Collections at the New York Botanical Garden, and Todd will introduce the program.
Thank you, Gregory, and thank all of you for joining us as we celebrate the opening of our new Native Plant Garden. It has been a much anticipated moment in my life and the life of all of my colleagues here at the garden. The Native Plant Garden is the result of a great collaboration between the Leon Levy Foundation, the New York Botanical Garden, and Umeå Sweden. Its opening represents the culmination of our multi-year effort to restore and re-energize the 85-acre heart of our 250-acre National Historic Landmark landscape. Our vision was first and foremost to make a richly layered four-season garden that celebrates the spectacle and subtleties of our native flora. We wanted to make a garden to delight all who visit, whether they already have a passion for native plants or if they haven't yet succumbed to the charms of ironweed, bloody butcher, wake robin, or sweet bay. We set out to make a garden that will serve as our generation's contribution to our institution's long history of displaying and studying native plants. A garden that will introduce new generations of horticulturists and conservationists to the plants that define the character of our region and sustain the birds, dragonflies, bees, and butterflies that make us feel connected to something larger and more powerful than ourselves. It is my privilege to introduce a group of distinguished speakers we have here who can illuminate the historical context and ecological, horticultural, and design principles that informed the creation of the new Native Plant Garden. Each of these speakers is a true leader in their field, and each has inspired and influenced those of us who care about native plants and believe that gardens can and should be as beneficent as they are beautiful. Dr. Robert Noxie, the Botanical Garden's Arthur J. Cronquist Curator of North American Botany, will discuss the garden's 120-year commitment to documenting and conserving our native flora and share early results from his ongoing research into how native plant populations are responding to environmental change. Dr. Douglas Tallamy, chair of the Department of Entomology and Wildlife Ecology at the University of Delaware, will discuss the essential role that native plants play in sustaining native birds, insects, and other wildlife, and teach us how gardens provide the opportunity to support efforts to preserve biodiversity in our region and beyond. Rick Dark, writer, photographer, and visionary advocate for sophisticated and informed horticulture, will describe how thoughtfully designed gardens can work with, rather than against, ecological processes to add both beauty and true life to the landscape. Sheila Brady, principal at Umeå Sweden and lead designer of the Native Plant Garden, will provide insight into how she and her team translated our vision for a contemporary garden brimming with native plants into a cohesive design that is both of its time and in keeping with the character of our historic landscape. Thank you all for coming. We have a very tight schedule today, so each speaker will introduce the speaker who follows him or her, and I hope you all enjoy this lecture as much as I will. Thank you.
Todd, thank you very much for that kind introduction. This morning, I am very excited to present an overview of the status of native plants in the face of environmental change. In order to be able to gauge the health of native plant populations, we must have a view of history. And the New York Botanical Garden is the best place to study North American plants because it is uniquely poised with its capture of this history, as I will now elaborate. From day one, the founding director of the garden, Nathaniel Lord Britton, was involved in the study of the flora. So he published, along with Judge Addison Brown, the 3-volume Illustrated Flora. The first volume appeared in 1896. He followed that soon after, just 5 years later, with his compact 1-volume manual. So the big innovation of the Illustrated Flora was that every species had its own line drawing. This was new. This was revolutionary. The manual was the condensed version for portability and ease of use in the field. Well, bringing us to the current manual, we have the second edition of Manual of Vascular Plants of Northeastern United States and Adjacent Canada by Gleason and Cronquist. This was published by the New York Botanical Garden Press in 1991. And of course, a lot of time and a lot of scientific discoveries have emerged since that point. So we have this legacy of 120 years that you can see with the illustrated floras, the editions of them, and the editions of the manuals. And to bring us to the present, one of the projects that I lead for the garden is the revision of Gleason and Cronquist, the production of a new manual. And this is online. So here is one of the pages that's up now, and it's also for production as a hard copy in the model of the traditional manuals, a portable field manual. Well, what does a manual give us? It is a reference that is indispensable. It's used as a textbook. It's used by gardeners. It's used by land managers because it has such information as scientific and common names, etymology of the scientific names, description of the physical appearance, the habitat, the geographic distribution, the flowering time, and the conservation status. Well, one thing I want to make clear, when I use the word Northeast, I'm not using it in the conventional way. I'm using it in the NYBG way. And this is an ambitious way. So the Northeast to us means a huge area that encompasses 29% of the area of the contiguous 48 states. Namely, it's 22 states and 5 provinces, most of them in their entirety. Well, one of the contributors to this legacy of specimens and floristic research and manuals and illustrated floras is this wonderful individual, George Nash, and I'd like to talk about him briefly. He was on the staff of the garden for 25 years, including as head gardener for 20 of those years, his last 20 years. He was a prolific collector and author on many plant families, but his scientific contributions are best known in the study of grasses. He was an agrastologist. He described 10 new genera and over 300 new species of grasses. And this is the type specimen, the specimen on which the name is based, that's preserved in the William and Linda Steer Herbarium of the New York Botanical Garden. Well, this is an interesting case. He named this grass Panicum sugatorum. What does sugatorum mean, and what does this have to do with why we're here today? Well, that's what I'd like to describe because it's a very interesting story. Sugatorum means of the hemlocks because the genus of hemlocks is Tsuga, such as the eastern hemlock shown here. Well, why of the hemlocks? Here is the description published by Nash in the Bulletin of the Torrey Botanical Club. And here we take a look. He gathered his type right here on the grounds of the garden in the hemlock grove. And this is the glorious, once glorious, hemlock grove in Nash's day. So he described this new species found right here in the Bronx. This was the view of the entrance to the hemlock grove, now the Thane family forest of the New York Botanical Garden, in Nash's era. And this is the view today. I took this photo last week. And you can notice it's from the same vantage point. Well, the big difference, of course, is hemlock is only a vestige of its former self here at the garden. And the primary reason for the decline of hemlock is the accidental introduction and then invasion of an East Asian insect pest known as the hemlock woolly adelgid, which sucks the sap of these trees, amasses such large numbers, has such a negative impact on the trees that there is very high mortality in eastern hemlocks. And this is the invasion map. Hemlock woolly adelgid was first detected in 1951 in the area of Richmond. But as you can see, it's still actively spreading and wreaking havoc in its wake. Well, this is, of course, an invasive insect. What about plants? Well, the story is we have many, many invasive plants, too, which are causing much ecologic harm. Well, one of the questions is, what is the rate of increase of invasive plants? And I have a study that's ongoing that I'll present here for the first, in which I'm looking at that rate. So we can see the number of species against time for the 50-year period from 1960 to 2010. And we can also see that the rate of increase is relatively constant, but it's also a high rate, the graph that is steep. As one colleague of mine says, this is really scary. Well, what makes it so scary is there's no sign of abatement of this introduction and establishment. These are only those species that are established in the Northeast. And if we can gauge from this rate over the last 50 years, in the next decade, we will have 7 more species of non-North American exotics established in our flora, 3 of which will become invasive. Well, some might argue change is part of life. It's part of nature. It happens, and that's true. But let's take a quick look at the kinds of changes that we see. We see long-term changes such as glaciations. These are very gradual, and they occur often over large scales. We also see short-term changes such as storms, fires, floods, and volcanic eruptions like the results of Mount St. Helens. Well, here, 13 years after the 1980 eruption of Mount St. Helens, we see plants such as this sedge recolonizing. But what I'm most interested in are anthropogenic changes, such as habitat destruction, introduction of invasive species, and pollution that we humans have wrought upon our environment. And in the course of my research, I am testing the hypothesis that current anthropogenic floristic change is occurring at unprecedented rates and geographic scales. And I'll be speaking about this for the rest of the presentation. By floristic change, I mean changes in the composition and abundance of the plant life. Well, let's take stock of this. And to put it into perspective, we need to consider conservation and what floristic change means for conservation in our floristic heritage. So when you think about it, the members of our flora, all of the species, boil down into 3 groups. First, we have those native species whose populations are relatively stable, like the cardinal flower. Then we have non-native species, like the lesser celandine, most of which have expanding populations, including invasive species. And then we also have a group of natives, such as the swamp pink, that are in decline. Well, don't just take my word for it. Let's review the literature that is mounting. And we can see studies, most of them in New York and Massachusetts, one in Indianapolis region, in which drastic declines in native species from 10% to 44% of the native flora is recorded as having declined. And ultimately, what this leads to is extirpation, meaning local disappearance, loss of species at a local level, and then carried even farther, extinction. Well, all of those studies were based on narrow geographic areas. And what we need is a habitat-focused study. And for that reason, 2 years ago, I established a project that's ongoing on the conservation assessment of intertidal plants of the Hudson River. The intertidal zone is the zone of land that's exposed between low tide and the limit of high tide. And that land is available, as we see here, for colonization by plants. Now, there are several reasons why intertidal plants are one of the most important groups to study for floristic change. First of all, these plants are poorly known. Many of them are restricted to this habitat, and they're restricted to the Northeast. The intertidal habitat itself is quite rare. It's also extreme, so that every day plants are inundated by high tide and alternately exposed by low tide, and then that cycle's repeated. It happens twice every day. That's pretty extreme for a plant. Also, numerous factors threaten this habitat, anthropogenic factors particularly, such as development, pollution, erosion, saltwater intrusion brought about by global warming as sea levels rise. So the point here, and what makes these plants so key for this study, is given their restrictiveness and the numerous environmental threats that they face, these plants are very sensitive indicators of environmental health. So to give you an example, I show you the Estuary bidens, a member of the sunflower family. And I'm showing on this map the total global distribution, which is limited to 7 rivers. And this is actually one of the more common species of intertidal plants. Now, for an introduction to the Hudson River estuary, the portion of the Hudson that is tidal. First of all, many of us New Yorkers don't even realize this, but it's a long estuary. It's one of the longest in the Northeast at 153 miles, stretching from the mouth of the Hudson at Battery Park, the southern tip of Manhattan, all the way north of Albany to the city of Troy, where a dam stops the tidal influence. And then another thing to keep in mind is tidal fluctuation is only moderate. It's about 3 to 4 feet. This study is possible because of the historic record of herbarium specimens, such as here at the New York Botanical Garden. So let's take a close look at this label of Isoetes riparia, the river quillwort. High water line, mouth of creek, just above Peekskill, August 1869. William Leggett, the collector. This can only be Ansville Creek. And I have been there. Habitat remains, but Isoetes riparia is no more in that place. How we do this work, and when I say we, I want to acknowledge my field team. I have an assistant as well as several dedicated volunteers. We access various points of historic collections along the Hudson with kayaks, and then we intensively explore, looking for the presence or absence. We also explore some previously unexplored areas. So this is a self-portrait. And the work is muddy and it's wet and it's wet and it's muddy. But for us, motivated by conservation and our interest in plants, we're all passionate about this. We don't mind the mud and the wet. Well, let me give you results now. A number of the species, such as water hemp, are secure. That means they're doing okay. We have sufficient numbers of populations, in this case 29, that we don't really worry. And my code here is I show the historic populations documented by specimens in gray squares and the current day ones in red circles. Well, the river quillwort is an example of imperiled species. We know only 3 populations, whereas in the past there had been 15 documented. And let me say another thing, there was never a systematic survey of the Hudson Estuary. It was very opportunistic, so no doubt this historic baseline is an undersampling. Unfortunately, there's a third category, and that is extirpated species such as Parker's pipewort. Parker's pipewort was common. It was known throughout most of the estuary, and we cannot find a single plant. The results are grim. Of the 21 species that we're focused on that are restricted or nearly restricted to the Hudson, most of them are in trouble. Only 29% are secure, 47% are imperiled, and nearly a quarter are actually extirpated. These are preliminary because we have 1 more year of field work. So far I've presented a really grim picture, and I don't want to leave you with that note because there is a lot of reason for hope. We still have 4,050 species of beautiful and fascinating native plants. And today, as we celebrate the opening of the Native Plant Garden, we have real reason to celebrate. And another reason, it's not all grim on the Hudson either, is that story with the river quillwort. Those 3 populations that we discovered last year are the first sighting of this species on the Hudson in over 70 years. Also, we botanists keep discovering new species in the Northeast, such as this sedge, resinous Czech sedge, described by David Warrior just a few years ago and named for his mentor and eminent sedge expert, Tony Resnicek. Other good news, just 2 years ago, I found this species for the first time on the grounds here in the Thane Family Forest. And then I'd also like to emphasize that an individual has tremendous power in what the future will be. So I hope to inspire you and motivate you to join habitat restoration projects and other activities that are really blossoming in our area. Here on the grounds of the New York Botanical Garden, especially in the Thane Family Forest, we are engaged in active restoration. And then I'd like to acknowledge a whole host of people who have helped make this work possible. First of all, the New York Botanical Garden and its benefactors for providing me the opportunity to advance the legacy of study of flora of the Northeast. My Good Fund Trust and Hudson River Foundation for funding the Hudson River research. Stephen Sinon for help with our archives. Jessica Schuler for help with the forest. My field team. Also, lots of help on GIS, the Geographic Information System's way of mapping for the Hudson Project. And then finally, other folks who have generously shared their photographs. Thank you very much, and it's now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Douglas Tallamy.
Thanks, Rob. It's a pleasure to be here. My job today is to talk a little bit about why natives, what is so important about natives, what are their roles. And I want to start by talking about this bird. Birders around the world will recognize this as the resplendent quetzal, beautiful creature from the forests of Central America. It's what we call a specialist, has a very specialized food diet in the form of the little fruits of avocado trees. And in that it's a specialist, it really depends on these avocado trees. If you don't have avocado trees, you don't have quetzals. And these days we don't have a lot of quetzals. It's an endangered species because we have cut down our avocado trees. And now we're recognizing we better plant them again, or we're going to lose the quetzal. And that type of relationship is common throughout the tropics. This is the great green macaw. It will only nest in mountain almond trees. And of course, we have cut down the mountain almond trees, so desperately trying to put them back. That's a jaguar. It also has a very specialized relationship with a plant, with palms, and in particular, palms that make these types of palm nuts. Why are jaguars attached to these types of palm nuts? Because that's the favorite food of peccaries, and that's what jaguars eat. But specialization, the point here is that specialization is not a rare phenomenon in nature. It is the fabric of nature. It's the rule, not the exception. And it always starts with plants. And it's not always restricted to the tropics. I mean, we have a lot of specialization in the tropics, but we have a lot of specialization in the temperate zone, too. One of the most specialized interactions between insects and spiders occurs right in our backyard. This is the bola spider. It's called the bola spider because it drops a single strand of thread, puts a little sticky glue glob at the bottom of that, looks like a bolus, and she goes hunting with this. She hangs from her leaf right off the back porch of your house, and then raises it up and down like I used to fish, hoping I would catch something. I watched this the first time and said, you're never going to catch anything. But what I didn't know is that she was releasing the sex pheromone of one species of moth. And she, within a few minutes, attracted the male of that moth because the male thought she was a female moth. And she had it made. The problem, the connection here with plants, is that she is not going to be able to attract that moth if that moth is not in the environment. And that moth will not be in the environment if you don't have the host plant that produces that moth. So even animals we don't think of as specialists have very specialized relationships with plants. A good example is our friend the chickadee. Now, we always think of chickadees as seed eaters because we see them at our feeders all winter long eating seeds. And in the winter, they do eat seeds. They can live off them entirely. But when they're making more chickadees, when they're reproducing, they switch to a specialized diet of not just insects, but caterpillars. Now, they could eat grasshoppers, they could eat crickets, they could eat plant hoppers, or syrphid flies, or katydids, or leaf hoppers, or click beetles, or tree hoppers, or sow bugs, or centipedes, or millipedes, or spiders. They could eat any of those. But instead, they exclusively feed their young caterpillars, which means when you don't have enough caterpillars to feed chickadees, you're not going to have any chickadees. Well, how many caterpillars does it take to make a chickadee? I've been thinking about this for 10 years, and it took me till last year to actually ask that question. And it turns out it takes an awful lot. Chickadee parents, the male and the female, cooperate in feeding the young, which means they can bring back caterpillars to the nest once every 3 minutes. In one 27-minute period in a nest in my backyard last year, they brought back 30 caterpillars. So how do they do that? By bringing back more than one at a time. And sometimes they bring back a whole bunch. And they do that from 6 a.m. to 8 p.m. all day long. Now, if you look it up in the literature, it will tell you that a pair of chickadees will bring back 390 to 570 caterpillars every day that they're feeding their young. And they feed their young for 16 days. So if we get out our calculators, that's between 6,000 and 9,000 caterpillars required to make one clutch of chickadees. And this is a tiny bird. Third of an ounce, which is 4 pennies, I think. What if it were the red-bellied woodpecker that weighs 8 times that much? How many caterpillars does it take to make an red-bellied woodpecker? And of course, we don't want just chickadees and woodpeckers in our communities. We want titmice, and we want blue jays, and we want yellowthroats and bluebirds and wood peewees and many other birds. So you can just picture the fantastic amount of insect biomass that's required to maintain complex food webs like this. What types of landscapes are going to be able to make those numbers of insects? Before we answer that, we've got to think about the relationship between insects, the specialized relationships between insects and their host plants. It turns out that 90% of the insects that feed on plants are what we call host specialists. They're feeding on one or just a very few lineages of plants. And they're specializing on plants because plants don't want to be eaten, and they protect their tissues with nasty-tasting chemicals that make them either bitter or downright toxic, which means an insect cannot walk up to any plant and just start eating it. It has to have specialized adaptations to be able to get around these particular chemical defenses. They have to develop the enzymes, the physiological mechanisms, the behavioral adaptations that allow them to eat these plants without dying. A good example would be eastern red cedar. It's actually quite a toxic plant. It defends itself with a monoterpene called beta-thuyaplicin. And most insects cannot eat beta-thuyaplicin. So it's well defended against most insects, but the juniper hairstreak has specialized on beta-thuyaplicin. And now that's the only plant that it can eat. If we don't have eastern red cedar, we will not have the juniper hair streak. We also won't have the curved line angle. You see it there? Right there. There's the caterpillar. So it specializes in what it can eat and also specializes in looking like what it can eat. Highly specialized relationship. All right, so what happens then when we replace native plants with plants from outside of these local food webs? Here's the one data slide I'm going to give you. This is a hedgerow in Maryland, and it represents what we see an awful lot of, particularly as we move south in our, quote, our natural areas. This is an area that has been invaded by autumn olive, by privet, by Japanese honeysuckle and bush honeysuckle and multiflora rose and oriental bittersweet, and I can go on and on and on. So we've got a large portion of the vegetation as being from outside of the local food web. If we compare the caterpillars in an invaded habitat like that with the caterpillars in a habitat that's largely intact, most of the plants there are indigenous. They have been interacting with local creatures for eons. Well, we will find 5 times more species of caterpillars in the uninvaded hedgerow and 22 times more caterpillars, which simply says that those plants from someplace else are very poor at making the caterpillars that my chickadees need. So does that matter? Well, it does matter if you eat caterpillars. And it's not just chickadees that are eating caterpillars. It turns out it's an awful lot of the birds that when they're feeding their young, because caterpillars are excellent baby food. They're soft, they're high in protein, they're easy to digest. And it's not just birds that are eating insects. It turns out it's an awful lot of things. All of our spiders are eating insects. Many insects eat insects. Tremendous diversity of insect predators out there. We've got frogs and toads. And as a matter of fact, all of the amphibians are eating insects. Freshwater fish get 60% of their protein from terrestrial insects that fall into the water. Our lizards are eating insects, bats, rodents, mesocarnivores. They're all eating insects. Even things we don't think of as insectivores eat a lot of insects, like red foxes, black bears. 23% of a black bear's diet is insects. And even things that don't eat insects require insects, like this sharp-shinned hawk. It's a bird predator, but you're not going to have sharp-shinned hawks if you don't have the birds that it eats. And those birds need insects to become birds, because birds are rearing their young on insects. So what types of landscapes can sustain these types of complex food webs? Well, first we want diverse landscapes. We want landscapes that have a diversity of the plants that support these specialized interactions with all of that bird food that's out there. So the more species of native productive plants that you can have in a particular area, like more complex a food web it's going to be able to support. We also want landscapes that are rich in the co-evolved relationships that are required to sustain these food webs. Again, the reason those invasive plants, the autumn olive and the multiflora rose, are not supporting caterpillars is because they have not been here long enough for our insects to adapt to them. We think that happens overnight, but it's actually many hundreds of years and probably thousands of years before these interactions can develop. And finally, we want to put the most productive native plants into our landscapes. And that brings up an important point. All native plants are not equally productive. Some are quite unproductive. So let's focus on the ones that are high in the ability to produce the food that is required to sustain these food webs. Things like oaks. Oaks are the most productive genus that we have. 534 species of caterpillars supported by the genus Quercus. And of course, those are the backbones of the native plant garden here at New York Botanical Garden. Compare that to ginkgo. We could build a landscape out of ginkgo, and we do that in many urban centers, but they only support 5 species of caterpillars. And I've never found a caterpillar on a ginkgo, so that's what's recorded there, but not common enough to support my chickadees. Number 2 on the list is our native prunus. This is a black cherry, but any of our native prunus support 456 species of caterpillars, 456 species of bird food. Compared to Zelkova, now it's becoming the dominant street tree, at least down where I live, supports 0. So these plants are doing something. We have to look beyond what their appearance and think about their role in our native ecosystems. Now, why do we care if we make landscapes that support biodiversity? Because biodiversity is what creates ecosystem services, and ecosystem services are what create humans. We humans need ecosystem services, oxygen and clean water and all of those things from functioning ecosystems to maintain our populations on this planet. There was a large study, the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, came out in 2005, hundreds of scientists from around the world, and one of their major conclusions is that we have already degraded 60% of this planet's ability to make ecosystem services. That's not a good idea, because every time we add a new person to the planet, we need more ecosystem services. And right now, every time we add one, we're getting fewer. So it's biodiversity that creates them, and as you add species to an ecosystem, ecosystem function goes up, which means as you take species away from an ecosystem, ecosystem function goes down. It is incredibly important that we maintain diverse ecosystems simply from a selfish perspective to keep these ecosystems pumping out those ecosystem services for us. So when we create landscapes that look like this, that are based largely or entirely on plants from someplace else, we're ending up with a drastic reduction in biodiversity, even though many people consider this a very beautiful landscape. Compared to a landscape like this, which is almost entirely native plants, where the biodiversity would be much higher. And I'm going to argue that is also a beautiful landscape, but it's a functional one. Now, somebody's going to say, what about all those berries that these non-native plants are producing? This is bush honeysuckle. They make berries, and the birds eat them. That's why it's invasive. They poop them out someplace else. Aren't they good for the birds? Because they're making berries. Well, yeah. And when they poop them out, of course, then you get this understory that's nearly a monoculture of bush honeysuckle. And the problem is they will provide food for the birds for 2 weeks. And I don't know what the birds do the other 50 weeks of the year, because these plants are not making any insects. And particularly when the birds are reproducing, these plants are biological deserts. Those berries are not around when the birds are reproducing, and they don't feed berries to their young. So this is the problem. You get an invasive species replacing the native plants that do make the insect food, and we have a problem. Same story with autumn olive. Forms these monocultures, even though it makes berries in the fall. Same thing with burning bush and privet and Japanese barberry and buckthorn. They're all serious invasives because they make berries that feed the birds, but it's not enough. It's not enough to make more birds. So why native plants? It's not because we're nostalgic for the past. Maybe some of us are. It's not because we dislike foreigners. I have read that about myself. And it's not because we oppose change. It's because we need functioning ecosystems. It's not debatable. We absolutely need them. So, native plants are the foundation of the terrestrial food webs that run the ecosystems on which we depend. And I want to close with a story about a butterfly from South Florida called the Atala butterfly, because it illustrates the power of native plants in terms of maintaining these food webs. So this is now a fairly common Florida butterfly, a beautiful lycaenid hair streak, and it is one of those specialists I was talking about. That's what the larva looks like. So all stages, that's the chrysalis, all stages are quite beautiful. And then it emerges again as an adult. Well, it's a specialist on a plant called kunti, which is a native cycad that has a very narrow distribution at the southern tip of Florida. The Seminole Indians used to use kunti roots as a source of starch. They would pound the roots into a paste, turn it into a flour, and then add it to several types of food. And it was delicious. And when the settlers came to South Florida, the Seminoles taught them how to eat kunti as well. And the settlers loved kunti too. They loved it so much that they ate all the kunti. Kunti was eliminated from South Florida, except for a few plants in some formal residential landscapes. Well, of course, if you eliminate the kunti, that's the host plant of the Atala, you eliminate the Atala. And people realized, it's gone. And then we instituted the Invasive Species Act in the 70s, and people wanted to get the Atala listed as an endangered species, but nobody could find any Atalas. So Congress said, no, you got to have Atalas to put them on the list. And it was officially declared extinct. Well, about that time, landscape designers discovered Coontie seriously as a really productive landscape plant. It has wonderful habit, low-growing, evergreen shrub that is drought-resistant. So it was great, and they started to promote it and put it in landscapes throughout South Florida. Now it's a common plant throughout South Florida, and lo and behold, the Atala butterfly showed up again. There must have been some remnant population deep in the Everglades that found its way out, and as I said, now it is a common species in southern Florida. So I think this is the quintessential example of the conservation power of our residential landscapes if we landscape them with productive plants. Without getting the Atala listed as an endangered species, without spending one dime of very valuable conservation money, in other words, without even trying, the landscape industry managed to save this species or pull it back from the brink of extinction. So think what we could do if we actually made conservation a goal of our gardenings, and that's exactly what has happened right here in New York. So we can save nature if we embrace the specialized relationships that are nature. And we have to think seriously about those native plants to do that. Thank you very much. Our next speaker will be Rick Dark.
Doug and I are both very relaxed because we turned a book in on Friday to Timber Press. It won't be out for 16 months, but it's very much about what Doug has just talked about and what Rob brought up and what I'm going to talk about and what Sheila's going to finish with. We're in an interesting age right now. We are going to kick off a native plant garden today, and what I want to submit to you is that this is a new kind of native plant garden because it's a new kind of nature that we're dealing with. That's the garden. When Todd called me and asked me if I would like to come up and be part of this, I said I'd love to because I am trained in botany and ecology. I knew a little bit about the rich legacy of native plants at the New York Botanic Garden, but in the process, I got that much more deeper into it, and it's an exciting time. Now, this is where I live. I'm in a helicopter. Actually, I wish I was in a helicopter like this, flying over this garden this morning. Todd's going to work on that. Because, as you'll see this afternoon, the garden is spectacular. And sometimes you just can't see the scale of it until you get up in the air. I learned this years ago working on a lot of roadside vegetation. Now, we're in a Bell Ranger helicopter. The machine's turned on the side. We're going in a circle. Our seatbelts are fastened tightly and securely above our waist. And we're rear doors off, so I'm shooting straight down. Now, I shot 75,000 color slides before switching to digital. And if you've ever, tried scanning a slide, you know what a pain in the neck it is. And you wind up with little dots and dust and things in them. So, with that in mind, what's that? It's a digital image. So forget the dust idea. What is it? It's a great blue heron flying 50 feet above the water. I like these images because what they talk about is scale. They talk about complexity. They talk about perspective. This is not wilderness. Wilderness is gone. The wilderness is actually a bankrupt idea. Wilderness is about the place where the last best species reside, and we're not there. Well, guess what? We're everywhere. And I'm still not sure about the invasive exotic model, only because it kind of counts us out. When we use the usual definition of nature, it's always there's us and there's them. It's nature, it separates mankind. And we really are one continuum. Raymond Williams, a man who wrote a book called Ideas of Nature many years ago, he said nature is just a singular term for the multiplicity of things and living processes. I can live with that. So if we accept that we're all part of it, let's look at what we're living with now. Now, this is my set of books on my Sommer piano next to my lamp. It was done in the year of my birth. This is what I learned on, and this is still a wonderful set of books. As Rob was mentioning, this is something that came out of the New York Botanic Garden. when I came up here in October, because I wanted to see the garden in fall, and it's very difficult to take October shots in May. And so I fell in love with this plaque. How many of you know this plaque? Okay, I'm going to ask you some questions so you can see the answers. I can see them too. So who put the plaque up there? The New York Bird and Tree Club. We've come full circle. We're kicking off a new native plant garden today that really has its origins in combined resources, combined perspectives, combined disciplines. This is the modern way. This is the new nature of native plant gardens, and it is ultimately suited for a new nature. It is honoring Elizabeth Gertrude Knight Britton. How many of you know anything about her? Well, you know, she and her husband, Nathaniel Lord Britton, they made a trip to Kew. They fell in love with botanic gardens and thought, why don't we have one in the Bronx? I asked Todd yesterday, what were the oldest botanic gardens? If you're thinking about, 1800s, what botanic gardens were there in North America? Only 2 others. This is a really early garden, and it was founded very much on the idea that we should be teaching and learning about our indigenous plants and all the things that they support. So there she is. She's at a microscope. Oh, by the way, what is that? Rob, you can't answer. It's a vasculum. I used these for years when I was at Longley because we were making herbarium specimens of plants, and I've worked with specimens. Now, if you have not gone online and looked at the unbelievable offerings that are accessible through the Mertz Library and all the collections, this garden is a tremendous resource. So this is May 1940 talking about a program at the Botanic Garden, May 9th, a while back, and it's talking about the original Botanic Garden and its wildflower garden, Gertrude Knight. And here's the Journal of the Botanic Garden in 1940 talking about the dedication of this. It's the Bird and Tree Club is dedicating this plaque. And some of the notes from the program, they're talking about the bronze plaque that's a gift from so-and-so, put in the rock. If you wait till you see that rock today, and it's hard to believe how it got there. But Palmer and Ricker, 2 other NYBGians, are talking about the fact that, at the time, they've just witnessed the loss of the chestnut tree. And he's saying, the problem is we continue to recite poems about the spreading chestnut tree long after the chestnuts passed out of existence. We need to be doing something before we get to that point. So, there's the rock. I got this photograph from the archive yesterday with Todd and the library's help. So they are moving that. That's a Massey Ferguson, for those of you that are interested. And that is the rock that has the plaque in it. And there is the plaque there in the new garden now. Now, there is Elizabeth, and she is making, in an early bulletin, she's making a plea for more and better local work. I love this language. She's talking about the fact she was a major biologist. She's made incredible contributions to our understanding of mosses. And she's talking about working with dried specimens. If you've ever done it, it's not that much fun. And she's saying, I'm basically cooped up working with these dried specimens after they've been torn from their surroundings, all breath of the woodlands gone, many times all records as to seasons, habitat, date, place, conditions, sometimes even the name of the collector gone as well. So she's making a plea for those that would get out and look in the landscape like Rob is doing, like any of you can do. This idea of citizen scientists, it's very real. You've got quite a resource here. Everybody's got some little digital widget now that can record something that might make the difference in the depth of our understanding about how these things work. We need all eyes on. Now, she wrote significant articles in the Bulletin of the Torrey Botanical Club. This is 1897. She's writing a monograph of Ophioglossum. It's one of our ferns. How many of you know that publication? Okay. It was the Torrey Botanical Club. It's still around. Here, in 2004, it's the Journal of the Torrey Botanical Society. You can join it online. Here's a flora of the Highline. Has anybody here ever heard of the Highline? It's over in Chelsea. So here is in the same tradition. Here's Richard Stalter, Department of Biological Sciences, St. John's in Jamaica, and he's doing a study of the flora on the Highline before it's touched. This is what you get before you spend $190 million. And And look at this, the native species to introduced species, 8279. Nobody needs to feel bad about that. There was a significant native flora up on the High Line, 40 feet in the air, no irrigation, no pesticides, no maintenance, no nothing. I've been photographing the High Line for 12 years, and I have photographs going up to the Empire State Building looking down. It was green from the top of the Empire State Building in August before it was touched. Now, this is the laydown area on the rail yards. Do you know that grass? It's Eragostus spectabilis. It is a kind of it's a long-lived self-seeder, but it's a short-lived perennial. It comes in and it lives in spaces. It's seeding in within a year on the laydown area on the rail yards. Do you know what that plant is? This is the rail yards at the High Line. It's Eupatorium altissimum. And actually, there's a bit of debate. Stalter called it Hyssopifolium. I think it's an intergrade between that and Hyssopifolium. But we don't know these plants that well. I can tell you this. I've only seen that 3 places growing wild. They were all post-industrial landscapes. Getting back to that invasive thing, anthropogenic is a nice way of saying it. We are the ultimate invasive species. Get over it. We are. We are the only species that goes in and dominates every environment that we get to, changes everything to our needs. We're in control. We're the world's gardeners. Better get used to it. Take responsibility for it. This is not Pete Adolph's work. Pete's a good friend. I love his work. He's never done anything better than that. What is it? What is it? What is it? It is that Eupatorium mixed with 2 of our warm season bunch grasses. And it is reflecting the habitat caused by rails and sleepers. These plants are adaptable, and I'm happy to be alive now. I mean, what's the alternative? I do love living in our age, and I want to see how we can invite these plants into modern life. That's the Cary Furnace site in Pittsburgh. I work with them, trying to get them to take a conservation approach to the emergent landscape that's there. This is a 19-year-old student from SCAD, and she loves this environment. We're in there. That's Greg, is the director of the Pittsburgh Botanic Garden. We're in there looking at the flora. 50 feet up inside the furnace, what am I finding? Growing in a 1/4 inch of grit on steel plate. I'm still going to call it Aster divaricatus. If you want to call it Eurybia, go ahead. But it's Aster divaricatus and Eupatorium rugosum. They're 50 feet up inside the furnace. These are adaptable things. So here you are back in the garden. And if you say, all right, we're going to make a landscape that's functional. I know a lot of you got a lot of spare time on your hands, but some of you are busy people. You probably work, you play, you're filling life with a lot of things. And so when we're making gardens, those gardens need to be functional in a number of ways. They need to be livable landscapes. This is a livable space. This is part of Sheila's work at this great garden. There's that aster. And so I know, Rob and I were talking about this last night on the train, when the new flora is completed, under the habitats for that aster, it's going to include 50 feet up on steel grating inside a steel mill. Because that's the truth of it. That's now. That is the nature of today's ecology. But here it is mixed in with these sedges. We weren't gardening with these sedges. 20 years ago, nobody was growing Pennsylvania sedge or Appalachica or a whole bunch of other sedges. The list just in this garden alone is as long as your arm. You didn't have anything to do with that. Or Jody? Yeah, I thought so. There's the same shot this morning. Same shot. That's October, and that's this morning. So the trilliums are in there, the phloxes are in there. You've got a resilient ground cover that goes right through to fall. And these are, as Doug has said, we've got to sustain many things. These are all sustaining many things. This garden talks about permeable walkways. It talks about grace and architecture, but layering. And part of what the thesis of the book that Doug and I just did is we need to put the layers back. If we're going to have landscapes that are full of life, they have to be layered. We need a certain amount of bricks and mortar, but we need a lot of architecture that is truly organic. We need to be making our spaces with organic architecture. Look at this pattern. But those are in very good balance. Those plants will take a very minimal amount of intervention to keep them going for a long time. So there's your new carpet, and it works. And there are a lot of good things. I got this plant. It's Carex laxicomus. I was given this by the nursery that introduced this 20 years ago. We put it in our Landenberg, Pennsylvania garden 20 years ago. It's now got a cultivar named Hobbs. or bunny blue, but it's been in the garden for 20 years under a little path made of pawpaws. We don't irrigate our garden. We use no pesticides, no herbicides, and there's just two of us. We have a really needy dog. And so we can do that with plants like this, and we need to know more about them. Look at the way Sheila, Jody, all these people have filled the niches and the nooks and crannies in this landscape, working with the topography. I wish I had rocks like this. But working with the grade, working with the slopes, working with the transitions, working with process. Do you think they just put that there? How do you get a tree like that? You let a seed drop. You let the seed germinate. It finds sustenance in the crevice long enough to support a seedling. And the roots grow down through the cracks and find greater sustenance. And then you've got a 60-foot tree. Some of this stuff just takes time. And we're always in such a hurry to see that everything looks gangbusters the minute it's done. And so we overplant, and we plant things that don't have root systems that sustain them. And part of making these landscapes livable is thinking about all of the resources that go in to sustaining them over time. I love that landscape out there for things like this. There's organic architecture making a window. This is back in October. What's this on the ground? It's Aurelia racemosa. And we were talking about this again on the train last night. This is an immediately local native. This isn't something from Arkansas. It's from here. It's part of your heritage, and it's something to be celebrated, as is the dogwood, as is this. If you've read Doug's book on Bringing Nature Home, and you look at the sustenance value of some of these things, this is Viburnum prunifolium. It's a winner. And it's a great malleable shrub or small tree. We can bring a lot more of this in. This is, again, October. All these asters along the low, wet area along Sheila's watercourse. Jody and I were out there in October just wandering around. I just wanted to get a look at it, get a few shots so I had something of the landscape in October. And as we're there, here is this eastern phoebe. It's, buzzing up and down, catching flies and whatever. The relationships were already there in October. The garden wasn't even done. These are all shots from the garden. This is tufted titmouse. And they were finding meaningful, functional habitat in that garden even last October. If you look at that, this is dry here, it's dry there. That Aster oblongifolius, again, you can switch the genus if you'd like to. It's doing really well there, and you come up close on it, and what are you seeing? Now, these have been in the paper a lot, and they need help. And we can do it with good gardens. This is a shot from 7 o'clock this morning of that meadow. And one of the things that is really wonderful about this landscape, it's walkable, it's watchable, it's accessible, it's got plenty of neat edges and things that anybody can look at this and say, I see a landscape, I see a garden. But it's got seasons, it's got transitions, it has interior, it has edge, it has low moist areas, it has wet edges, it has wetlands. It has sunny spaces and shady spaces. So there is the meadow this morning. Can you imagine what it will look like in mid-October? How about get a little closer to it? Wetlands. This is October. And I was interested to come back in spring and see. So when I was out there walking around with Jody yesterday, and just down from here, I saw a garden with a little rill, and this finch saw a bird bath. They're out there. The garden, at 7 o'clock this morning, the garden was so full of birds, it was remarkable. This is a walkable space. It is a place that you can come through and be surprised because there's a lot happening there. Yes, there's color. One of the things that I think makes really good sense, even though I think, Jody, correct me, there are almost 400 species of plants in the garden. This garden has a lot of repetition, and repetition is good. Repetition, if you've ever spent a lot of time in native habitats, you see that things do repeat. If there are healthy communities, things do repeat. And when you use repetition in the garden, you do simplify maintenance. So if you find things that are really adapted to the site, you make these big gestures, as Sheila has done. You get a workable landscape that's maintainable. This garden is about layers. We outlined in this book, where you've got to be looking from canopy right to below ground. That wonderful white red bud was out there before in the earlier garden. There are new plants out there, and they will look like this in short order. And I think Doug can tell you that's a little, call it a bee, it's a ground nesting bee. We're worried about bees right now. We should be. But we can do things about it. I love the labeling in the garden. This is a sign talking about woodland ephemerals. We've become so superficial with some of this. You think about woodland ephemeral, and a lot of people just say it's a wildflower. A woodland ephemeral is something that is programmed to come up and take advantage of the light early in the season when the deciduous forest is deciduous. There's light then. These plants come up like trilliums, and they bloom. There's trilliums this morning. This is mertensia. That is a spring ephemeral. What do the spring ephemerals do? Why are they ephemeral? They complete their cycle, and they go dormant by summer. What does that matter to a gardener? Well, one of the questions I get asked all the time is, I've got a garden, I've got big trees, I've got shade, I've got dryness on the ground. What can I plant there? These plants don't care how dry it gets in July because they're dormant by that time. So there's a lot of functionality in working with all the different denizens that fill these different layers. We know more about them when we look more closely. Not a spring ephemeral. It's a spring wildflower, but foam flower comes up and then the foliage stays through the year. This is a spring ephemeral, this is not. So if you grow May apples and you want something to go underneath them and keep the ground covered, well, what works? Well, you could plant sedum tornatum. You can plant ginger first. We need to learn about the layering and the following on, the footprint. Talk about native plants for home gardens. It's very real, but we need landscapes like this one you're going to see this afternoon that show the beauty of it, the functionality of it, the practicality of it. So if I said to you, okay, blueberries. Now, Doug could probably talk for 20 minutes about how blueberries fit into the whole trophic system, and it's all very true. But if you say, well, okay, so I'm going to get a few blueberries and just dot them around the landscape, that may not do much for you if you really need a hedge. So how about if you just reinvent the hedge? That's a hedge in the garden at 7:15 this morning, and it's all high bush blueberry. We can do this. So I just want to leave you with the idea that I know, how many of you are New Yorkers? Okay, well, New Yorkers love to hang out. I grew up in North Jersey, but this is the city that I've known since I was old enough to be let loose in the city. And this is what that garden looked like this morning. So it's going to be a wonderful, wonderful addition to the Botanic Garden, to our understanding of these systems, and to the legacy of this great place. Next is Sheila Brady, who is really the artist behind this whole scene.
Thanks so much. Good morning. This is such an exciting morning. It's such a delight to be here this day, 5 years later, with so many friends and colleagues in this exciting opening. We're going to start with they've asked me to look back and see how this garden started. Thanks to Doug and Rick, they've given you the backbone of how much research our team had to do in order to make this a thriving garden. But this morning we're going to talk a little bit about vision and how that vision came to be. Vision's an important word. It is what holds your threads together in making a garden. So first we're going to take a tour. Excuse me, I can't read my little laptop here, so we're going to work together on this. We'll take a tour of the slideshow I'll show you. We'll start here at the Visitor Center, the beautiful pavilions designed by H3. And we'll talk a little bit, this is the water feature, the wetland that filters and cleans that water feature. Then we'll come up into the woodland along this wonderful woodland path. We've preserved the existing woodland trails. Then we'll come around to Britton Rock, come down, cross North Bridge, and let you look at the wetland, and then see the wonderful wet meadow along the base of the wet feature, water feature. Then come up through our beautiful path in the Music Meadow, that's sort of your mid-meadow, the ridge, the high point of the meadow. We'll come around into the glade that's sheltered under these magnificent oak trees, and then end up in our native border. So our goals were very clear. We wanted to respond to this incredible site that you were just told a lot about. It was an historic context. And of course, we responded to the brilliant program that NYBG developed for us. It was going to be a contemporary garden. It was going to be a garden that would respond to the site's diversity of microclimates and provide biodiversity. When we see this site, you'll see that this is an extraordinary 3.5-acre site that has an enormous amount of biodiversity. That had a lot to do with how this vision evolved. Very importantly, we knew from the onset we were going to distill, not just distill and abstract the flora from the Northeast. We weren't going to replicate it. And we were going to integrate a sustainable water feature, and most importantly, we'd have this to be a garden to learn about native flora and natural ecosystems. And the garden has done such a beautiful job in interpretive signage for us to make sure that happens. So this is where we started many years ago. We mapped out the site. Even in our early proposal stages, we knew that these diverse ecosystems had to be understood. We had to understand the slopes, the degree of angles, the soil chemistry, all of those variables. Once you've got that mapped, then you can understand what native plant communities will thrive in which of these typologies. So we had these garden rooms based on all this information that would enable us to have these gorgeous settings. So we'll start here at the existing conditions. This is where we started after the garden had closed down the original native garden. And we knew right away that we wanted to expose this woodland floor in order to bring this carpet of spring ephemerals. This is the wet stream that was through the middle of the garden, and that was a very important component in our mapping to understand where the groundwater was and where this central water feature would be. So you can see here we've already started to clear the woodland floor. This is thanks to the remarkable work of the Hort team. And we've exposed the beautiful gneiss rock. And this is that wet stream that ran through the garden. And we had this wonderful opening that was going to be ideal for a meadow. So this is a very early concept sketch. And you can see it was inspired by Martin Perger's piece of sculpture. I had been slaving away in a charrette to try and get the form of this garden. We had mapped it, we understood it, but how do you bring that form together? And in vision, inspiration is everything. So I took a pause and went to the National Gallery and came back and said, oops, sure enough, we had this remarkable form that would work. We'd have our cleansing wetland that could filter over a body of water. We'd have a promenade with a visitor center. We'd come up to the very important ingredient that we wanted to preserve, the Britain rock that Rick just told you so much about. And we'd have split rock. Oops, sorry. Let's go back. Sorry. Just a minute. There we are. There's split rock. So that early vision and inspiration is quite critical. Our water feature was going to be sustainable. We wanted it to capture all oh, sorry, don't mind this. There's this, we wanted to capture all our surface runoff. We would have all of our water collected in pipes, come back to a cistern. We wanted to make sure we use biofiltration in the water feature itself to cleanse the water. We did a great job in minimizing portable water. It's all stored in cisterns underground. We used no chemicals to treat this water, and we've sourced all our stone from the wonderful quarries by Bruce O'Brien, our stonemason, and we did a great job harvesting our black locust that's all sustainably harvested here. So here's the garden that Rick showed you this morning. Many of these ingredients were part of our program, that we wanted a waterfall, we wanted to have a wetland, and we were going to preserve and enhance this gorgeous woodland that was there. A quick understanding of this filtration system: we have an equipment vault below grade, a storage cistern. Essentially, sounds easy, but it wasn't, as the garden will attest. Water is pumped up. It's pumped into the wetland. There's a below-grade filtration system of sand and gravel. Then it's fed up through the plant roots and then released again. There's a secondary filter, a UV filter that also enhances the cleansing process. So an early concept sketch. I know these are very fun to go back. These are almost 5 years ago, and you can see through these series of sketches and information what our native plant community inspirations were and what our early concepts were. And for the native garden, the woodland, this idea of having a carpet of spring ephemerals and clearing that woodland for using trilliums, ferns, and sedges with flowering seasonal perennials has indeed worked out. This gorgeous design and illustration by Hilary O'Judge, part of our design team, shows you a little bit about the complexity we had to do. It all is well and fine as a designer to want to use all these plants, but we then had to figure out, thanks to the leadership of Jody and all the Hort team, what was our microclimates that would have this wonderful display of trilliums and tiarellas? Where would they grow and what niches would they grow in? The wet woodland would terminate in a much wetter community of plants. So the displays that you'll see have so much thought and research behind them, thanks to so many people in this room. The Hort team has been unbelievable. This is the garden, the woodland. The bluebells are in full season for everyone to go out and see very shortly. Viewing across, the idea here was to have these rooms, but to have all separate views across, so you could see into the glade. This is the other garden room that you'll see shortly. This is the dogwoods just coming out in their glory. The tiarella, foam flower in masses that are thriving already. And this is that beautiful combination that Rick showed you, where we wanted to use this complexity of commingling our plants and yet have it very legible. The beautiful Carex plantagenea here, commingled with the euchera, the asplenia, and then the successional fall blooming exemia coming up. All just a wonder. You can see this is just during construction. We staged this. A very exciting palette of plants to learn from. We've just moved out of the woodland, and now we're on the promenade, coming around Northbridge, viewing the wetland. An early concept idea of we were given volumes and volumes of plants. Part of the role of the designer is to distill all of that information and determine which can you use, what will give us those important ingredients that have been addressed this morning, and then how can we make this cohesive and appealing. So the main cleansing plants are the Acarus, the Scirpus, and Carex. And then we have this wonderful display of upland seasonal plants. The Sarracenias are going to be glorious for people to come back and see. So this is the very first plantings. This is when you can see the Acarus is just, it's early today. You'll see very few are up, but this is what it looked like when we were there. The heron's already taken over, which we are thrilled about. And we're still hosing down. Jody, I think this might have been one of those 105-day weather plantings that was pretty exciting. So we're going to cross across. This is the North Bridge. We're going to cross up into the meadow now. This is the wet meadow. You can see the sorghastrum here in full bloom. So this is our existing conditions for the meadow. Ideal. We had this beautiful, beautiful historic frame of trees that we could leave. Our early concepts, again, we wanted to borrow this idea of birch groves for our screening and separating from the adjacent beautiful rock garden. I like how these early concepts, we deviated from them. Our palette now is much richer. It's more vibrant and colorful. So that's part of the design process, to learn from it and move on. So this was developed by, this is beautiful drawing by Marisa Scalera, our other co-design team member. we were faced with the next morning of more than hundreds of thousands of plugs. They're about this big. And you've done all these years of research. You have all these construction documents, but you still have to go out there and lay them out. And this was just a way to have us color code it. You know, we had these wonderful color coding systems, and still to give this structure a visual appeal. And then you can see the forb layers that come up seasonally for you to come back and see this summer and this fall. There are so many. This is just a moment in the garden. And this is our very first season. It was really so exciting to see the aspera, the Lytris aspera is a beautiful new Lytris we had never used before. The Eragrostis here that Rick had showed you earlier, right here at the foot of Split Rock. A little later in the season, the Spirabolus here, a native grass that is just a wonderful grass for those of you who haven't used it. It's backlit in the light. There's the Trichides a little further, the Schizocarium, all of these plant communities that we've heard so much about this morning that will thrive and enable a successful native plant garden to work. What the garden looks like throughout the season is incredible. It's important to a designer, important to the audience to come back and appreciate what do these gardens look like in the fall. There's that beautiful blueberry hedge that we have, the Cornus sericea in its wonderful autumn color. Just wonderful plants to learn from. The ridge, the same sketch qualities to help us orient ourselves when we're first out there. I have to admit, like most of us that have laid out gardens, you really at some point you have to stop and use your intuition and use those 5 years of everything that's out there and spontaneity. It's that artistic quality that we all have, and when you use that with a lot of research behind it, it becomes a very fun process. So this is the first season of the ridge. You can see that beautiful Schizocarium popping through, all the Euthymia tenuifolia, glorious in its first season. Moving to the glade, this is the meadow that we were just in. This wonderful Iris cristata is just opening for everyone today. It's much better than the photographs. And we've fallen in love with this new Aquilegia chrysantha right here for those of you that want to try a new Aquilegia. I think it's been on every plant list for the past 5 months that we've been working on in the office. And then the last garden, the native garden, the native border. I think this was one of the most challenging to lay out. It was difficult. We had to lay it out in season in order to give it the structure. We wanted to show all of you that you can use native plants in a display structured way. That this part of the education of this garden is to understand native plants have every possibility of how to use them. They don't have to be just in a wild meadow-like setting. So this was where to give that structure, we of course used the traditional border idea of a foreground, a middle ground, and a background with a wonderful display of dogwoods and shrub layers behind. But we tried this new idea of putting some structure in with these vertical accents. And you can see our sketches here to what we had to do this in seasons and what would be the tallest. It's complicated. It takes a lot of time and thinking and constantly this three-dimensional thinking. This was laying that out the very first day. You can see we're still in pots. And it's fun. I hadn't seen it until yesterday, so its first season is just coming about. It will be wonderful to see this summer and fall. So in closing, this is a remarkable garden. It's a vision that is a collaborative vision made up with so many people. The leadership here from Gregory and Todd, Jody and all of the Hort team, Shelby, Liz, and John. You've had such astute comments all the way along. Our incredible team at OBS, incredible, talented designers, and our consultant teams. It's that collective vision that has made this garden certainly a tribute to the native flora of the Northeast. So let's go see it and enjoy it.
Well, hello everyone. I think we do actually have about 3 minutes for questions. These have been the richest and most wonderful presentations. We should all thank these speakers for bringing so much to us this morning. It's incredible. So, how about 3 questions? 3 questions for Sheila about the design process. How about those beautiful drawings by Sheila and her firm? Beautiful, beautiful drawings and all those beautiful photographs by our earlier speakers. Okay, everybody's intimidated. 3 is not enough. There's one. We'll take one question. It's yours.
Could you explain what you meant by distilling and taking a non-habitat-based approach to the design?
Sheila, I think that's a question for Sheila.
Very briefly, I think what we wanted to do is not replicate a pine barren or not replicate a dry savanna. Some of those native plant community photographs I showed you of our early inspiration, we weren't going to transplant that microclimate directly. Instead, we distilled moments of that. We wanted to abstract moments and distill those. That's what I meant by that. We weren't going to replicate those and bring back in a pine barren or bring back in a dry savanna.
Well, that was an excellent question. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, everyone. So now we've had the richest morning. Now it's time to go out and see the garden for ourselves. The trams will, if you go back out through the Ross Gallery, the trams there will take you to Azalea Way and to the new native plant garden.
We're even earlier.
Fantastic.
It's really, we're coming up and working with these folks. How it goes.